Brings us now to our superintendent's report, and I will turn it over to Dr. Melton.
Thank you, Chairman Gant, board members, and community. The first thing I'd like to share this evening is an update. We were out of school last Thursday due to Hurricane Michael, and we were so fortunate that we were spared in this community and our facilities withstood the storm. Celebrate the leadership of each and every team of our facility supervisors and also our principals who did on-site reviews of every campus to know that we were ready to resume normal activity on Friday. So I celebrate the work of all of our folks. We also had a first last week. Our student nutrition staff came to prepare us very quickly to make sure that when students left on Wednesday afternoon, they took home some care packages to be sure that they had food to eat the next day, because obviously we have so many students that rely on breakfast and lunch from our student nutrition program. But we had over 300 students that took home care packages within just a couple of hours of preparation. So I'd like for our community to know that's the caliber of people that serve our students every single day. So thanks to Mr. Biedenbow and Mr. Richardson, I suspect you'll make sure that you convey that appreciation to he and his staff. More than 300 kids ate on Thursday that may not have had a meal. So I'd like to make sure that we stop just to celebrate that leadership and that commitment of our staff. In your board brief for this week, you saw an update regarding our facilities study. Just to make sure that the community is aware, we have completed our on-site visits. Like everyone else across the state, schedules have changed because of missed days. We had to make sure that we are a partner with MBCon, which is a group that we have contracted with to do this work for us. So just like our schedules have been revised, others have been revised as well. Mr. Richardson and I have met with some representatives from MBCon to answer questions that they may have. We've given them a variety of documents. Whatever else they may have discovered they've needed, we've been able to produce for them that work. But just to make sure everyone is reminded, the scope of the work that includes for this facility review has been focused upon our individual facility evaluations. That's a physical inspection. It also includes facility recommendations to us per individual site. That's something that they're working on to make sure that includes a scope of improvements to make sure that we are optimizing our facilities and the capacity in which we can operate. And the third and overall objective of this is to make sure that our projected cost with categorical summaries with also some priority of recommendations are brought forth to us that we can consider as we move forward. There have been some questions within our community directed towards Mr. Richardson and to me about athletic facilities. That is part of the scope of the work, but I also celebrate the community leadership that have reached out to Mr. Richardson and me to make sure that their voices are heard, just to supplement and to echo what they have been able to share with the representatives that we have had on our sites throughout the course of the last several months. So we're delighted to share that the work has now been finished on site. Mr. Richardson, I'm sure, is delighted. Okay, now he's smiling. It's been a project of love so far, but the work isn't finished. Just the first phase is finished, so now we're getting ready for the second phase. Shall I continue, Mr. Gann, or do you think there may be questions about that particular item?
There may be some questions. Anyone have questions regarding the facility study that's continuing and not completed? Mr. White.
Quick question, but and maybe you're going to answer this with phase two. But what comes after the study? They're going to say basically here are the needs, is that, and then is the next phase figuring out prioritizing what to do about needs?
Yes, sir, and I appreciate that. Mr. Richardson and I have been waiting for this summary. We have been, I should say, forewarned. It's been predicted for us that the list is going to be excessive. It's going to be a large price tag if we try to tackle everything. So we need to start getting some priority order, and we need to engage some voices to make sure that it's not just the experts that come in and give us this feedback. It's us looking at things holistically in our community, using a variety of stakeholders that we need to make sure engage with this process. So phase two would be, I would imagine, Mr. Richardson and me first sitting down to get a summary of their findings, and then after that, what kind of recommendations have they done in other districts that may fit our style, but more importantly, what is it we're going to charge them to do with the next phase of work to include them to take this forward and use the results that they have found for us. Mr. Richardson, anything that you'd like to add that I may have forgotten?
Mr. White, you good? Ms. Hammond.
My question is along exactly what you were saying. I just want to be sure I understand. So as far as the assessment, that's finished.
Yes, ma'am.
Now the next step, like Mr. White says, do you know how you'll choose the stakeholders? I mean, because there's so many. Would it just be people from each school, or would it be community members from each school? I'm just trying to get an idea, because I know it's so many needs, and, you know, it's a limited amount, so I was trying to see how you would go about choosing.
Yes, ma'am. I appreciate the question. We don't have a structure plan in place yet, Ms. Hammond. We need to wait and see what kind of data is going to be given to us. We want to make sure that it is holistic of our community. We've got to make sure that there's an opportunity from a variety of stakeholders. I'll use an example of a division. If we included high school parents with an athletic frame of mind, that isn't truly representative of our entire community. We need to make sure we look at elementary, middle level, high school level, people with different interests that they may have. So you'll hear in just a few minutes about our planning committee that we've done, and hopefully you'll hear some of the thoughtfulness that has gone into selecting a variety of stakeholders. So with that, we would need to make sure that we mirror that process for this. But remember, this is going to have facility recommendations for every facility in School District 5. So if we had representation from every single school, that committee can become quite cumbersome, and how much might they accomplish? So we may be leaning more so on our School Improvement Council, which are elective members in our community, and then some additional representatives that may not be parents but may be community members. So we're going to design it to make sure that we're looking at community needs, not specific individual needs at one school site or one campus. Absolutely.
Any other, Mr. White?
I'll just share, I think I was related to the last time, but the last time we did this, I think Ellen and Jan and I were all in the committee, but it was an interesting process because we had the superintendent selected. I don't know how many people were, they represented. There was a good many from the community, administrators from schools, and even some of the people that were opposing schools were allowed to come in, but they broke everybody up and had them go like in separate corners in a room and prioritize the needs. And they all came back together and started matching up their lists. And from that, we came up with this one priority list. But it was an interesting process, but it was fairly cumbersome, but I do think it's important.
To have a fair chance of representation from the schools if they choose to do it.
Hopefully you'll see the next in 2 presentations from now, you'll see that's the kind of selection we've done with Elementary School 13, where we've invited community members, we've invited parents, we've invited staff members, we've invited clergy, so a variety of people have been invited to be included on this committee, and we would need to replicate that for this same kind of response with facility study.
Before you go to your next item, everybody make sure you push your little button here and the green light's on. I mean, your mic is working. Everybody got a green light? Okay.
Okay?
Dr. Melton.
Thank you, Mr. Gant. Our first official agenda item that's of record tonight is our process of audit. Mr. Richardson is going to do our introduction and create some context for us. Mr. Richardson.
Thank you, Dr. Melton, members of the board. We have a special guest with us tonight. Ms. Dawn Strickland is a partner with McGregor and Company. She is going to, well, she's actually about neck deep in an audit right now for our school district, but she's going to give you a brief overview of the process that they go through during this annual audit for us.
Good evening. I first wanted to tell you where you can probably get some information on the South Carolina Department of Education's website on the audit. And I brought with me, I didn't print this year's because I'm trying to conserve paper a little bit and use it from a PDF and electronic copy. But this is the annual audit guide that the South Carolina Department of Education puts on their website. And there's a lot of good information in here. It's what we use it, we refer to it all the time during the audit. And if you're on I want to tell you where you can find it on their website. If you haven't gone to that area, it's under the Finance tab, and scroll down and there's Audit, and then there's the Audit Guide, which is here, and then there's also a lot of other information, valuable information in there on how to account for all the different types of revenues, expenditures, and the processes, and a lot of the procedures that we're required to do are described in that audit guide. Now, on an audit, we have the AICPA, the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants, has the generally accepted auditing standards. Governmental entities, the school districts, counties, towns, state. If there are federal funds, we fall under the Governmental Accounting Standards Board, which is another set of standards that we have to abide by and test with. And then if you have spent over $750,000 in federal funds each in your fiscal year, then you fall under the single audit or the uniform guidance, which is now called. So that is another set of compliance and procedures that are done. It's multi-levels depending on what type of revenues and expenditures that the entity has. What we normally start with is you have to come in, get an understanding of the entity. We have discussions with various staff in the finance and human resources, and I've already had discussions with Dr. Melton. You know, just we go in and we get an understanding of the controls that are in place. We do walkthroughs. We follow a sample of transactions through to see revenues and expenditures, how they are accounted for when the money comes in, how it comes in from being collected all the way to deposit and recorded, and the same with disbursements, approvals, procedures, if it's recorded in the proper place in the general ledger. In order to do this, you cannot, in an entity this size, and in most of them, you cannot do 100%. And all of these standards will go through how to choose samples based on your size and your number of transactions. There are formulas in all of the guidance that they give us. So we go through, and based on the number of transactions, there's complicated kind of procedures we go through, and we determine a sample size. Randomly choose, so you're not skewing your sample. You randomly choose your sample, and such as tested transactions for controls over disbursements. We'll choose based on check numbers or transactions. We'll choose the sample. We'll walk through those to see that approvals are in place. If they needed, if they met all the guidelines on being in the proper account, or if your purchasing policy was adhered to as far as if it required bids, depending on the dollar amount. And this is all just a random sample so that we can get it across the whole district. As far as we read the minutes, we go through and get the board minutes to see what has happened in your meetings. And for the various areas like pupil activity, we select schools, test a sample of receipts and disbursements to see if they are being collected in the classrooms and following all the way to the deposit. We pull samples of those and see what's the holding time of the deposit, if they were receipted. Disbursements, we go through and test a sample in selected schools each year on if the money was being paid from, if you collected it under this fund, if you're actually paying it out from the proper fund. As far as cash, we look at reconciliations, look at the following bank statements, see if all your outstanding items are true outstanding items. Revenue, the South Carolina Department of Education posts, they call them payments to counties reports. And there's a time frame that you can go in and you can go on their website and you can look at all of every school district in the state. And we pull it down, and it is a very comprehensive report that shows each payment that was paid to the district during the fiscal year, and it's categorized by if it's Title I money or if it's kindergarten. It's all categorized, and we trace every one of those into the general ledger to make certain that they are there. If the state says they paid it, we trace those. And then we have to look at the deal with receivables. The same with county taxes. And in this district, we have to contact both Richland and Lexington County. We get the reports from the county treasurers of the tax revenues that have been collected and the delinquent tax receivables that are out there for those years. All of that information, we request it from the two counties, and those confirmations and all that information is sent back to us, and we trace that information into the general ledger. For payroll, we look at the quarterly reports, the 941s for the FICA and the salaries and the retirement. And we agree that back to the salaries that are actually recorded and the FICA and the retirement. Due froms and transfers. You have multiple funds in your accounting system where most of the cash is held in the general fund, so you're going to have the due froms between the general fund for them paying and collecting, and for the other funds, we make certain that all of the due froms agree to each other. If one fund says it owes $1,000 back to this fund, we need to go into that fund and make certain the other one's the other way. Expenditures, again, the Department of Education provides, we have to acquire a login into their system, but they call it GAPS, which is the Grants Accounting Processing System, and it shows the expenditures as the district files claims, and let's say under Title I, you're going to have salaries of $80,000 that you claimed. It will show what quarter in that GAPS report. We will go back and we'll trace that to make certain that what y'all are saying y'all are claiming and giving that information to the school, to the Department of Education, that is actually what is in your ledger, and that is actually what y'all are reporting. And as I mentioned briefly, when you spend over the $750,000 in federal funds, and this is recently up from $500,000, $750,000, then you'll fall under the uniform guidance, used to be called the single audit. And that's where you will have to determine which of your federal programs are your major funds. And that is another calculation. We use the service, PPC is our, they provide a bunch of checklists and confirmations based on all these GASB and the uniform guidance. And there is a calculation where we look at the federal programs, the dollar amount in each one, and we have to determine when it was tested last, because they have to, over a certain dollar amount threshold, they have to be tested every so many years, and we have a certain dollar amount that we have to test each year in the federal funds, and that's why the same one won't be tested every year unless there is a major finding, then it has to be tested again the following year. But we determine the major funds, and whenever you get to that, then there is a separate, depending on what the federal money is, the program, there is another separate set of compliance. Like as in food service, you're going to go in and you're going to test eligibility, you're going to test the vendors where you have to file the claims with the commodities and all of that. There's a whole list of information where we have to go through. IDEA, you're going to have to test a sample of the actual student IEPs and go through those and see if they actually were qualified or if they were actually served. Those are compliance issues are determined by which major program you actually selecting to test each year. School bus drivers, that's another, you have to make certain that the alcohol, that certain number, the proper number have been tested for alcohol and drug, because that is a routine testing. We have to see that the proper number you have hit the percentage. And then also that their driving records have been reviewed. We have to go through and all of this information. That's also, you can look in the State Department of Education, they have a very good guidance on that. When we get to capital assets, The district has a $5,000 capitalization threshold, which means any item with a life longer than a year, that's initial cost was $5,000 or more, you're going to capitalize it and you're going to wind up depreciating it for governmental activities. And with that, we go through repairs and maintenance accounts, capital addition accounts, and we review and we test to see if items over 5,000 were actually captured and put in y'all's capital asset listing and depreciated properly. When we come to the debt, we send confirmations to the financial institutions that hold your debt, your bonds. We confirm the balance, the payments made during the fiscal year. We trace all that information into your books to see that the payments were actually recorded and the proper fund and all of that information. Food service, we look at the inventory. Each school provides an inventory at June 30th. And we look at that information and see, because by then you don't have as much as during the school year, but we get the food inventory and trace that into the general ledger. And so there are some items where we're actually testing the exact dollar amount, and then also we're looking overall at the controls on how the items were recorded. And then at the end, we pull it together and take the general ledgers and the trial balances, any adjustments, and pull them into the financial statements that you see whenever we present that with all of the notes. And then you have the audit reports. The first report in the front would have on the financial statements themselves, and you have the two auditors' reports in the back. One is in accordance with the government auditing standards, and the last, since you do have over the $750,000, is the uniform guidance report, where we report any findings or report that there were no findings. And that is a brief overview of what we do. If we get too detailed, y'all will all go to sleep on me. So, anyway, I will be happy to help, questions.
As a clarification, you are working toward a final audit, the annual CAFR, is that what you're headed toward now?
Yes.
And that's due to the district, when will we look probably to have that final report of all those different
It's
pieces?
due to the State Department of Education, usually December 1st, but it'll be December 3rd this year. We hope to have it middle of November is what our goal is, before Thanksgiving. We like to have it in November for your November meeting, but depending on how early it is.
Okay. Well, do you mind if we have questions? Any questions? Ms. Hutchison?
Thank you for that very good overview and lot of detail. Give me an idea of how long it takes, because this is very intense, and how many people does it take of your staff, and of course I know all of our staff is very involved, just an approximate amount of time, or when do you start this, what time of year?
We try to start this in the summer, where I know we don't have final numbers then, so that's when we come in and try to get our testing, where we can pull our samples and that information, get our confirmations out in the mail, all of that. We're here for usually about a week in the summer, and then we come back in this time of year after everything is closed out, and we have a trial balance, because we can't be auditing a moving target, so we have to have it stopped. And then once that is closed out and we have the trial balance, then we come back in for another week, maybe 10 days, to come in and try to finish up and get everything tied down. And hopefully we can get all of that other testing out of the way, and just during the summer get a bulk of that. That's when we do a lot of the pupil activity and test the transactions and that information. And then once we get all of the work in here, it's probably another couple of weeks in here trying to get the testing finished and our numbers final. And then it takes, I would say, another week or so, week to 10 days, to get the actual financials pulled together, all the notes updated with the current year information, all of the reports. And I know the finance department does a lot with the statistical section in the back. And we have to kind of go make certain we have all of that information and everything's agreeing. So that'll be another couple of weeks on that part. And in our office, we have, I'm the partner in charge of the audit, so any staff underneath, I have to review all of their work papers. And then once I've got it completed and the preliminary draft is ready, then I have to have another partner within our office review everything prior. That's our policy in our office, review it before it can go out.
A lot of
We have
checks
to
and
take it.
balances
Yes.
and.
And we have a proofer in our office, go through the financials and make certain everything adds and goes from all the schedules tie from one to the other.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Ms. Hammond?
This type of audit, do we do this every year? I have a question, two different ones. When you do the samplings, that's just where you're checking the different schools? Or, because like something like where I wrote down where the bus drivers and checking their record, you would check every bus driver. There wouldn't be a sampling with them.
What we do with that is, we don't actually go and look at each bus driver. We have to review the records that y'all have maintained across the district.
I got you. So, but
And
we
y'all
would
have-
have that if there was any safety issue, that would be something.
Because you have to test a certain percentage for alcohol and a certain percentage for drugs each during the calendar. For some reason, they do it during a calendar year on that, so we have to look at that.
And I understand the sampling, because, I mean, it'd be impossible to check everything. When you have finished an audit that we do each year, because this has always been a question with lots of people within the district, because sometimes we have used this money. When you do all this balancing with the audit, where do you place the fund balance money that we get every year? I know that's kind of what's left over. That's
What happens is, right now, you started this, and we're doing July 1st, 17 to June 30th, 18. Is the fiscal year we're looking at. You started the year with the balance you had at the end of June 17. What we look at on this is all your revenues, less your expenditures within each fund. That net will close out to the fund balance. And after all the revenues and expenses, the net will close out to fund balance. So what happens with that?
Mr. Haltwater, and then I'll come Mr. White.
Yes, Ms. Strickland, I worked for the government at one time, and if you work for the government, you know you're audited a lot, especially if you receive federal funds. And that's basically how the agency operated. So when you mention the word audit, people immediately think there's something wrong with the agency. That's not necessarily the case. I mean, you're coming in to oversee what's going on, to suggest improvements in it, and those kinds of things. But the other question is, you do a random sample. You said random samples, which is what was always done. And Ms. Hutchinson asked about how long does it take? If you did 100% sample, you would be there the whole year, probably, right?
You would, and the cost of it
And the cost of it.
would be
Correct?
astronomical.
That's why you do samples, right?
You could not feasibly audit, you have so many transactions within this district.
Right.
You could not feasibly audit every transaction. You
Okay.
would not finish it.
Yeah.
And it'd be time for the next audit.
Yeah. We couldn't afford the audit.
No. And that's why that's why all the years of the Governmental Accounting Standards Board and the AICPA, they have come up with these procedures where sampling should cover and catch.
Right. I mean, yeah, particular
Yes.
areas that you're sampling.
Right.
Yes.
Now, if you are a very tiny little entity with
Yeah, sure.
20 transactions, yes, you can do it.
Right.
But not when you have this size.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. White?
We always have these conversations about fund balance, and while you're here, maybe I'd ask you to explain it, because we always get a conversation about, well, where's the money? You know, like there's a big bank account that equals our fund balance. And what I always sort of suggest when the board is having this conversation, that it's everything stopped and was collected, everything paid, that's theoretically what would be left over. But it's really just timing differences in what's coming in and going out. But how would you characterize what fund balance means in our financial statements for this board?
If it is the fund financial statements, you're going to have, and it's easier to have it in front. Whenever you're looking at the government-wide, you're going to have all of your capital asset costs in there, and depreciation, and then all of your debt, your outstanding debt. That is coming out, that's going to be your fund balance or your net assets on that point is going to be after all of your debts paid, and it's going to take into account the value of your, not really the fair market value, but the undepreciated value of your capital assets at the moment. So you're looking at two different numbers. If you're looking at just the fund balance in the governmental funds, and I'm looking off of June 30th, 17, you have included in a lot of this, you have receivables, and some of that is going to be, some of that is going to be the uncollected delinquent taxes, receivables too. So whether that's going to be collected, that's a question. In it, you're going to have accrued salaries. So yes, if you're looking at just the fund financial statements, you are looking at mostly timing differences. But
So-
whenever you get to the government-wide, that's whenever you're going to get your debt, and that timing difference there goes way out because some of these bonds go out for years before the payment's going to be made.
But am I correct when I say that there's no bank account with fund balance in it?
No.
And you just called it net assets. That's kind of like the net of everything. If we were to liquidate the whole enterprise, that's theoretically what would be left over.
On the fund, yes, and whenever you get over to the, it's two sets of statements in here. You have the fund balance, the fund financial statements, where you don't show your capital assets. Everything's expense, and that's a little bit more of a truer cash picture there because as you bought those items, they were expensed. So if you look at the fund financials, you're closer. That fund balance there is going to be a little closer to what cash-wise you have. But you're not going to have an actual bank account with that in there because you got money that's owed to you and money that you owe out. And that's where you kind of get to your fund balance. But if you go over to the government-wide financials where you have to put in all your debt, that pension amount, that pension liability, that you may never, I think we had that discussion about it a couple of years ago whenever it came on there. That's caught up in that, the net assets, which actually is a negative if you look at that. It's a deficit if you look at the, because of the pension liability. So if you look at the true fund balance off of the governmental funds, you're looking at cash with the receivable money that's owed to you and money that you owe out in a little bit of a shorter term.
So it's interesting because the governmental fund balance, it's a negative number. So if you had to pay your pension and all that, then you're behind. So it's not quite what it's represented. And Lynn's smiling. We never heard that story. I'm just joking.
Salmon, let's go to Mr. Cates. He hadn't asked a question yet, and then I'll come to you. Mr. White, were you through with your question? And I've got one.
You're doing a sample size. If you were to have a finding within that sample, do you increase the sample size at that point?
Yes, we do.
And this is a comprehensive audit. What would be next steps if you were to find a concern?
You wind up going, if you have an issue, depending on what it is, you may or may not increase. If it's a small item, you would not increase. But if it is something you need to increase your sample size to see if it's happening more, then if it doesn't, either way, we would address it to the staff to see why is this occurring, depending on what it is. Depending, if we increase the sample size and we caught it again, then we would feel like it might be occurring a lot more throughout the district. If we increase the sample size and found no more, we feel like it could have been an isolated issue. Either way, we would go and investigate it a little further and go and talk with the staff, go and look into the transaction more in detail.
And so you're able to expand the scope of your service within the district and then see if we have a pervasive problem or an isolated problem, and then examine our controls and our process, and that's where we would be involved in changing those controls or tightening up those processes.
Right,
But
we would
it's-
find if there was a deficiency, and that's where we would report a deficiency and then bring it to management's attention.
But I want to just be clear that just because we start with a small is relative, but we start with a sample size of A, it may expand as needed. It's not that you ignore the rest of the transactions. It just depends on how large a sample you need.
Right, if we've had to expand it and, on audits before and see if it was anything we needed to look further into.
Ms. Hammond?
My question comes along with Mr. White's question to you. From your answer, and I'm going to say the finances is not my forte, so I'll look to Lynn to explain it. But, one of the criticisms, and Ed's right, it's brought up, and that's one of the reasons I asked. I know we just passed the budget in which we did not increase taxes, and we talked about using some of the fund balance. I know that when we bought some land, I think Ms. Bumgarner said we had set aside $1 million for that out of the fund balance. The way you answer the question, and I may just have misunderstood it, the way you answer the question, it's like that money's not really there. And yet, we were able to ask what we have in fund balance, and that's one criticism we get as a board. So I was trying to bring it up and understand it and know how it should be used and how we get it when you do an audit, because I think it'll help people understand why we need it. I know Mr. White's always explained it helps our bond rating to have, a certain amount of fund balance. So to me, on this audit, this is just a good place to understand it. But, so you really were saying to me, unless I misunderstood it, you can't really say that money's in there because it's in assets? Is that what
If you're
saying?
looking at the governmental funds, you're going to have, and that the governmental funds is the one where you expense all your capital assets as you purchase them, and you don't show your debt. As you make a bond payment, you expense it then. What this is, you have, we'll just walk through the general fund on this one. You have $83 million in assets. And cash on that one is $48 million, just in the general fund in June 30, 17. You have money due from the county government. You have money due from property tax receivables. You have some prepaid items and other receivables. And you have payables and money due to other funds. So you have a net there of the $38,000 in fund balance. So it's your $38 million in fund balance is cash of $48 million. You have some receivables, but then you have $45 million in liabilities. You have received. So if you get all of your receivables in, you have money owed to you, that a good bit of that will be collected in the first few months of the fiscal year, because a lot of that is money coming in on the grants. And the payables will be going back out, the accrued salaries. The $38 million is not going to be specifically cash, but a good bit of it will be.
Then I'll be asking Mr. Richards, when you would come to us with a recommendation on how to use fund balance, no matter what it is, whatever you as a group come to us and think it's smart to use it, how do you justify how she defined it?
an example of what she's talking about in the notes of the financial statements, and I don't know if I remember the term, is it restricted now? When you restrict a portion of your fund
There
balance?
is some restricted, and then you have assigned for special purposes.
Is that, okay.
have that.
They changed some of the terminology, and I have a hard time remembering it sometimes, but what you do is set aside a portion of that. When we passed a budget showing a deficit, well, they'll show that in the audit this year, is that's set aside to cover that in the fund balance. If we have some capital needs, we can say we set aside a portion of our fund balance for that. So that's where that's done. Did I answer your question?
Thank you. That was where that confused me, because we have used it, and you brought it to us in ways you thought were wise to use it. So then I was confused when I may have misunderstood the way it was presented.
Well,
I get what you.
she's talking about a couple of different things, and I guess when we talk about fund balance, we're basically looking at a snapshot, and I mean, realistically, it's a snapshot on a certain day of the year of what our cash on hand is, basically.
Okay. Mr. White?
I just wanted to add one point, because we will have these conversations for forever, I think. But the fund balance is just, like you say, a snapshot on a particular day. But it's also, I think the theme that since I've been on this board is that you don't spend it for recurring items, because you spend it for emergency items, you spend it for cushion for debt service, and you spend it when you have unexpected non-recurring expenses, but you can't fund salary increases, you can't fund recurring expenses year after year, because it'll evaporate in a very short period of time. So it's not available just to spend. It's very limited in what we spend it for.
That's correct. And it also carries the district through those times of the year where we don't have a whole lot of revenue coming in from the state. Property tax relief is a prime example of that, where we, for approximately, July, up till October, we don't get a dime on that, and that's when we start receiving that. So there's several months during the first part of our fiscal year where we don't have a whole lot of cash coming in. As you'll notice on the monthly financial statements that I show you, the monthly financial reports that I show you, it's our expenditures are typically several $1 million more than what we're bringing in on a monthly basis.
And if we didn't have that fund balance, you'd have to borrow money.
We would have to borrow money.
Mr. Strickland, I want to ask you a question, too. I appreciate your detail. We know the annual report is coming, but this is one of the first times that we've had, and we had it requested, that we'd have some pre-audit discussion. So I appreciate you doing that tonight. And you and your staff, whoever works in this field, I appreciate it. But the audits you do are government standard audits. It's what's required of a government entity. Is that correct?
That's correct. It's what is required annually.
And it's pretty well laid out with State Department of Education, and it's laid out to them from government standard accounting. But occasionally, and it happens a lot, we'll have someone that'll say, well, you need to do a forensic audit. You really don't know what you're getting. You ought to do a forensic audit. Do you occasionally, if you look at every item, would you be doing a forensic audit, or do you understand what that would be, or could we afford to do a forensic audit?
Forensic audit would be, just as was mentioned earlier, if you do a forensic audit you don't really do it on the whole district. A forensic audit is whenever you suspect an issue in a certain area. And whether it's collections of a certain revenue, or you think there's an issue in the way things are being dispersed. Maybe there's some extra checks being written or something. That's where the forensic audit comes in, as you have to narrow it down to your scope has to be narrowed down on that. That's where the forensic part comes in, because you have to know where your issues are. Forensic audit on a whole district would be pretty much the 100%, because you don't know what are you looking for, what's the issue that's causing you to want to have the forensic audit.
Right. We've also had suggestion through some literature that was provided to the board, and just suggestion that we have upon a community group, which I looked at literature, was really talking about some people with some financial background maybe some, and general, but a pretty large committee. I think I was talking about a committee of about 15 people to do what was termed a forensic audit by this community group. You ever been part of an audit of that nature, or do you have any recommendation
Now,
for us?
In order to do an audit, you have to have, I mean, we have to have be licensed, which we are, and you have to have 40 hours or 80 hours of governmental CPE every year, every 2 years, and 24 hours, you have to have 24 hours every 2 years of the governmental CPE, A&A, accounting and auditing, and 80 years every 2 years of regular CPE, which 24 would be part of that. So you have to have all of these requirements done. I have never sat, I work for my firm. I don't work for a community group, and I honestly have not been party to that or dealt with a community group where usually is, you know, all I've ever seen are actual firms that actually go out and do the audits. I haven't seen people from different firms going together to make a community group.
And we haven't gone through that. We just had that suggested by some literature and so forth as a possibility. And the forensic audit word, quite frankly, comes up a lot in this community. And we had some audits a few years ago on some change orders in some construction projects, and the end result was it was very expensive to look at this detail, very expensive, to the tunes of thousands of dollars, and the end turnaround was hundreds of dollars, just in that category. So I think we learned a very expensive lesson there. But I did want to ask you about that. So we can look for the final report fairly soon, sometime in the near future. And we appreciate the detail you gave us. Now, anybody else have any questions? I know we probably got deeper into this. Mr. White.
Back to the thing about the audit, the forensic audit. It reminds me, years ago, there was a little town that I don't know, the town administrator or somebody embezzled bond monies that were supposed to have been spent on a water system or something. And that sounds like the kind of thing you suspect fraud or embezzlement, then maybe you have I think you gave a good example. There was a question about change orders, and we had an audit, and it cost multiples of what the outcome showed, that, you know, any discrepancies and you know, it was insurance calculations or something like that. But so it's not just something you willy-nilly do, and you got to have a really serious problem. Do you see many forensic audits in school districts in South Carolina?
We see some not to a high level. Because usually the issues that we see are not to that level. And whenever you get to a forensic audit, you have probably called in during your regular audit. You have uncovered some information and reported it to the district. They reported it to SLED, and that's whenever that would kind of.
So and it goes back to Mr. Cates' question. If you're doing an audit and you're doing sampling and you find something that's non-conforming, not only do you test more, but if you found something that was improper, then you might bring in law enforcement, and you may report it to management.
We're required to report it to management, and then if it is fraud and of possible illegal nature, and we do not get satisfaction from the board, then we are required to go further.
So really the process, what we do in audit, you're not guaranteeing there's no fraud there, but those procedures could easily detect something that's improper.
Yes, and as and it actually says it in our report, we do not specifically look for fraud, but as we do fraud inquiries, we question, if we see anything, we bring it to light to the administration, and if we don't, we keep going up the levels until we get a satisfaction of the cause of it and the remedy for it.
And Mr. Gant, the other thing we've heard is that we've been criticized because we select our own auditors. Is there anything abnormal about that? That a company hires their own auditors? I mean, y'all are trained to be independent in what you do and what you report and what you bring back, but
It was done on the RFP was sent out, so we bid and we went through the bid process and we went through the question and.
But you
all
don't
that
see third
information.
parties appointing school districts auditors. I mean, you get hired by the district, don't you?
Yes, we're hired by the
Yeah.
district. And that's the
par-
way it's supposed.
That's the normal
Yes,
process.
because that's who we work, we're hired by the district to do the audit. That's, in every district, that's the way it's handled. The
And you-
state doesn't come in and appoint auditors. The
Well,
district's
As a
responsible.
point of clarification, is this what year, how many years have you done an audit in District 5?
This is the last year on the, I think it was a 3-year.
3 year. And prior to that, you were not the auditor, so it was a change of audit
Right.
groups. So which is a pretty good thing to go through. I know this board went through a process of the interviews and so forth, but that way you've got a different set of eyes, the standards are the same, but you're looking again. Well, Dr. Melton, this is your report, but I appreciate the detail you've gone to help us understand it. Sounds to me you still got a lot of work ahead of you with a lot more
We're
detail.
getting there.
Thank you so much, Ms. Strickland.
Well, thank you.
Ms. Strickland, thank you for your work, and I'd also like to pause to thank Mr. Shealy, Ms. London, and Ms. Frick for their partnership to make sure that this is done with the highest attention to detail and the most support they could offer for your work. So thanks to the three of you and the entire department for all the work you put towards this.
Thank you, Ms. Strickland.
Our next report this evening on the agenda is a report on new elementary school workshops. We are fortunate to have been working with and also with Quackenbush. So this evening, we have with us Barb Holler and also Dan Neal to offer a presentation and update to the board regarding new elementary school workshops.
Programming is defined as a phase of school planning projects and process that provides designers with information about building user needs and patterns of use of space. What that really means is you want to right-size the facility, you want to ensure connectivity and efficiency, you want to do things that are environmentally smart, but most of all, you want to support the district's vision and mission. We started putting together, a couple months ago, started putting together the participants and stakeholders for this programming process. We had school board members, the superintendent, district office staff and senior staff, principals, teachers, staff members, parents and community members, and consultants. And interestingly enough, many people serve two roles. One school board member is also a parent. This group was very diverse. The atmosphere in these things.
Mr. Neal, our apologies. Our laptops are not coordinating with the presentation, so our apologies for the distractions. We're trying to see what's showing behind us, and we aren't seeing the same screens. Our
I
apologies.
see.
While I'm getting it, can I ask Dr. Melvin? Dr. Melvin, do you have a list of who served on the committee?
Yes, ma'am, we do. Mr. Neal, would you mind starting over since we are now operational from this viewpoint?
Is that good?
Yes, sir, I think we're ready.
Okay. Just going over this slide, because this is the slide, the only slide that's consistent with my talking points. During the programming process, the participants and stakeholders have been very diverse. It included board members, the superintendent herself, district office staff, principals, teachers, and staff, parents and community members, and consultants. And interestingly enough, several people serve multiple roles. one of the school board members is also a parent. A lot of the teachers and principals and staff and the district office staff live in the communities, and they have children in the schools. The entire process, going through the first two workshops, it's an extremely collegial atmosphere. Everyone gets to talk, everyone gets to say what they really think, and nobody's voice is overpowering. It's a very interesting process, and it's worked out very well, due largely, I believe, to the care in which we chose, or the superintendent chose the participants in the process. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Barb Haller, who is a partner with Quackenbush.
Thanks. So just wanted to go through a little bit of the process in terms of schedule and then also some of the activities we performed during the process. So as Dan mentioned, this is programming. We're at the very, very early stages in the process. As you can see by this slide up at the top, just purely defining initial concepts, the spaces that will be in the building, and so forth. The rest of the process includes developing the design, getting into the technical details of how you construct the building, ultimately working with a contractor to define a guaranteed maximum price for the project, and then construction. The anticipated construction completion will be for the fall 2021 school year. As Dan mentioned, we were just finished our second workshop, second of 3 workshops, and you can see they're roughly once a month, with the next one early November. This is our first report to the board on kind of this process. As Dan mentioned, several of the board have been involved in these meetings as well. At the end of programming, we will have a defined building program, as well as main features of the school, and the rough ultimate size of the school. So as we were going through many of these sessions, not only did we want to hear the current needs and traditions of the school district and community, but we also wanted this school to be future-proof, thinking ahead to the future with understanding that flexibility is important, sustainability is important, student performance is important. All of the items listed here were things we discussed through the process. I think one of the interesting quotes during our sessions were the kids that are going to be going to school in this school, the careers that they may have when they graduate don't exist. So we need to be flexible in the spaces we provide, but also how students are taught. We had several exercises over the course of the 2 days. I'm just going to share what those were. This first one is called visual listening. We put up dozens and dozens of images of schools across the country and spaces within schools, interior images, exterior images. Every participant had green dots and red dots, and everybody was able to put up a dot on their favorite image and least favorite images. And then we had a big group discussion of what were people inspired by on certain images, or what turned them off on certain images. And examples were they were welcoming, or some other examples were the spaces were too large for elementary school kids. So they kind of were a wide range, and it was a very good dialogue, ultimately informing some of the project goals. Another activity we did was called activity mapping. So we split into smaller groups. We talked about the percentage of time students spend on each activity, and this also informed the spaces required in the building. So some of the activities range from the traditional group instruction in a classroom, but to socializing, collaborating, performing, creating all of these activities, and ultimately informing, should we have more group study spaces or collaborative type spaces. Throughout both sessions, we talked about and focused on these 7 planning areas, the traditional classroom type spaces to professional, community, media, fitness, visual, and facility support spaces. We broke down again into small groups. Each group was tasked with one of these planning areas and focused on taking a really deep dive into this, not only the spaces needed, the spaces to support those spaces, and kind of the qualitative aspect of these spaces and how they would work together. Again, reporting back to the bigger group so we could understand how all the pieces of puzzles fit together. The very first thing we did with all the participants, we went around the room and introduced ourselves, and then everybody was required to provide an inspirational word for the new school. So it was kind of interesting to see a lot of similarities, a lot of common themes, and over the course of the 2 work sessions, there were a lot of common themes that came up, which informed these guiding principles. So the scale of the words you see are how often they were repeated over the course of our activities. So flexible, community, collaborative, innovative, inclusive. Safe was one that came up a lot, visionary, inspiring. And these ultimately came together as guiding principles for the new elementary school. So at the end of the second workshop, we collectively wordsmithed these 4 guiding principles. I guess I can read them really quickly. A safe and accepting place for all that connects the school and community, grounded in tradition, guided by innovation. A collaborative, inspiring culture that fosters critical thinking and communication. Flexible spaces that allow for innovation and rigorous practices. A focus on student learning and development of the whole child. So keep in mind these were guiding principles of the new elementary school itself, the building, but they could also inform the principles for how the school functions in the future. And that is it.
Mr. Gann, if I may add to this presentation, wait for the volume to catch up with me. Great, thank you. I like to echo the words that really were transparent to me of collegial, that I heard Dan say, but also collaborative, which I heard Barb say, because this entire process has been just that. The cross-section of representation, both within the Chapin community and outside the Chapin community, the roles have been varied. The partnership has been very rich. We very quickly created a community. So people very quickly created a rapport where they could share. Relationships have flourished in this environment. It's nice to see teacher leaders come together, and we've already told all of them that we are not accepting transfers to a new school because there's great excitement around the idea of creating this. But just to make sure there isn't any misconception or misunderstanding, we are not at the place of actually conceptualizing the exterior or the materials of a facility. Instead, we are starting with the core of the reason for the school. So the things that you've heard tonight in this presentation have been to focus on the instructional programming, which of course is what the heart of the school is supposed to be about. There have been some discussions about looking at the plans of where the facility may land on the plot itself, but as far as getting into any of the decisions for that, that's not happened. But I would like to make sure everyone draws their attention to the guiding principles and also the statements of what I imagine, because this is really where the heart of the conversation has started our work and where it continues to work. We've met 2 of the 3 times which the board has contracted for us to have this experience together, and then as you saw in the timeline, we're looking forward to taking this out to the community, to engage the community with whatever the role that may be, of anyone that may be interested to come and offer insight and offer some participation for the schematic plans of the school. Mr. Gann, I would like to pause in case there's anyone from the board who'd like to contribute who's participated with this process, just in case that would like to be shared.
I think that'd be great. But before they do, I'd like to publicly thank Ms. Hutchinson and Mr. Cates for representing the board. You spent some long, wonderful days so far, and I know you're going to spend some more time. I've been by very briefly, but I was absolutely impressed with what I saw going on. But if you all would expound on that, we'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Certainly, and I will agree that it is very impressive, and several things that just really stand out to me, but I'll share that Dr. Melton and her staff pulled together some of the true educator leaders in this district, award-winning teachers, and special areas such as librarian who won special awards, and the passion that she talks about when envisioning what a library should be like in this day and age and for the future. The PE teacher, I can't remember, he's at
Ben
Cross,
Landers,
yeah,
River
Cross
Springs.
River Springs, and the passion he talks about making sure that the right space is available for the students, and when the gym is needed by another group, that there is appropriate place either outdoors or somewhere else in the school so the students can continue to get the proper PE education. The math leaders and the guidance counselors, the people who are responsible for special ed, who understand the need for private areas when families need to come in, and not just special ed, but any families that need to come in and need some special attention where privacy is utmost. And someone mentioned we don't need this family traipsing through the school because it's a very private affair, but to put this room up at the very front. I would have never thought about that, but people who deal with this day in and day out said this is what we need. So I think that's the real benefit of having such a diverse group of professionals and other people that care about the schools, is that they all are bringing something from their area. They're bringing their own expertise and adding it to create this really wonderful puzzle that's pulling it all together. So it's just been a real pleasure just to sit back. I mean, I have contributed, but sit back and watch all these brilliant people get so excited.
I've been in a lot of trainings that at the end I wondered what I was doing there. Never in District 5.
I was going to say.
Never in our district, professionally, I should say. But I was amazed from the first really moments. We did have, as you said, so many subject matter experts in the room, but nobody was creating their own silo. They were bringing their expertise, but they were just as interested to say, how can these areas fit in a way that engages all of our students? How do we create community spaces that the community will be proud of and that are accessible, whether it's the school day or not? I think one of the keys to the early success that, from my observation, I don't think we could have, even though I think we have people with the expertise, I don't think we could have had this result doing this ourselves, bringing somebody in from the outside that is able to look at what's going on, not just in education in South Carolina, as all of the folks from Quackenbush bring such powerful experience to us, and we appreciate, but then bringing somebody in, even from a national, a broader view, has helped so that, often you kind of get within your lane and only see what's right in front of you, and it has really helped to look at the big picture. So thank you for your leadership. It's an outstanding process. Looking forward to the third day. I think the thing that I was so impressed is as you hear people talk and you can see generations of children that are going to be impacted. Some of those folks that I hope to live long enough, they'll be taking care of me. And, just amazing. Looking forward to that fitting, that setting, that site, that community. It's going to be a school to be proud of, and the process has been outstanding.
Mr. Gann, if I just may echo, we have to compliment and commend our players who have worked with us from outside of School District 5 because so collaborative. They listen, the number of phone calls, the number of virtual presentations we've seen, followed by a number of email exchanges that have happened. And I'd also like to pause and thank the executive staff for their continued contributions. This process has worked because of our partners and because of our inside commitment. I'm not sure if there's any additional questions, Mr. Gant, but otherwise that would conclude our report. And I'd like to thank you all for being here tonight to assist us with this presentation.
I do think Ms. Hammond has a
Okay.
question.
I had two. One with, I thought it was interesting how we are looking to the future, and an elementary school may have something right now that we're not even thinking about. Were the teachers that are on this committee, were they all elementary teachers?
They are elementary. We do have some intermediate representation as well
Yeah.
because we're not just looking solely at pre-K through fifth grade. We've got to look at the span beyond to make sure that students leave elementary and are ready for a
Right.
fifth and sixth grade experience successfully and then beyond.
Good, I was gonna ask that. And then, was the goal to, because I think, Mr. Gant, you and I talked by phone about this, because you asked my opinion. Was it looked at as a traditional elementary? You know, like you think of K through 5? Because, you know, we've got, you didn't look, it's not, the goal wasn't to like create a more like a magnet elementary school.
No, ma'am, we're not looking for a magnet in
right.
this area. At this point, we're looking for a traditional elementary
That's the
school setting, but we have not actually adopted a configuration necessarily. We are looking to see what might we need if it includes fifth grade. I'll use an example. Strings is offered to fifth graders in School District 5. So if we're going to include this as a fifth grade, then we need to make sure that we have space for that. But we've not got to the place at this point where there's been any drafting of that space and what that's going to look like. So the programming features thus far have been, as you see on the theme of the what we call Wordle in education, the word bubble. The larger the words, the more responses you've gotten, flexibility to make sure that spaces can be flexible rather than saying this room is for this reason only, and then it's vacant or not in use for 20 or 30 or 40% of the day, to make sure that the space is flexible, which means the space is used throughout the day for a variety of reasons.
That's good, and I would think that, and that is the largest
Thank you.
word I see, but flexibility, because of changes.
Yes.
And what might be the need.
Yes.
May I address the question as well?
Sure.
I think one of the values of this process is there were no preconceived notions. We knew it was going to be an elementary school. Obviously, we're not dreaming about a high school, but I think that was, and I won't speak for the group, but that was kind of liberating to say, I imagine, right? I imagine what would this look like? And to have such strong representation from all the core areas related arts, from social services, to help cast that vision is so often I think we think of the shell. We talk about schools, facilities, we think of the shell, the renderings, the drawings, the brick and the mortar. I think the value to this process is we're flipping that model and starting with the people. Those children that are going to occupy that space and those professionals that are going to nurture them and help them find their vision and dream. And that's important to say. We did not start with a lot of preconceived what this should look like.
And I would agree. I think it make every teacher happy. It's more driven by the programs and by the curriculum. And I get that.
Yes, ma'am.
And that's good. I would agree with that.
Good. Thank you.
Ms. Hutchison.
One important factor that I neglected to mention is that two very important people in that room. We had our finance director there who was helping us keep it real. Actually, he imagined quite a bit, but it was good to have our finance director. And we had Mr. Harris and Mr. Cato there to focus on safety. And Mr. Cato has some very interesting ideas, to say the least, and we can tell you about it afterwards. Or perhaps he can. Maybe we'll let Mr. Cato another day. But that was so valuable to have these two. And I'm sorry if I've missed anyone else, but other than instruction, I think it's important to show that we are thinking about finances and we're thinking about safety.
Any other question, comment?
Thank you, Mr. Gant. That concludes the superintendent's report.
And that will bring us to item number 12, which is our public participation.